Great. So I thought it'd be fun today to talk about a little bit of my progress with my listening comprehension with French and kind of how much I've been listening and kind of what my current level is. And the main reason is because I've officially passed 50% of my goal towards how much I want to actively listen to French. And so my goal has always been 1,500 hours, and that is just purely active listening. Pretty much only just watching TV or watching a movie without subtitles, actively paying attention. I don't count podcasts. I don't count watching it sort of in the background as I make dinner. I don't count any of that, mostly because I don't do it very much. I don't think it's a significant factor for my learning. I think if you did it a lot, very consistently, I'm sure it would add a certain percentage of improvement every day that you wouldn't get if you didn't do it. But because I don't do it very often, I don't think, and because it's significantly less useful than just actively paying attention and listening, I don't want to necessarily mess my numbers up. Now, you could potentially increase how much I've listened to by a little bit if you added up all the passive listening, all the podcasts I've ever listened to, any audiobooks I've ever listened to. And that might increase a little bit in terms of time, but I don't think it's particularly relevant. But that's just my own opinion. Again, the main reason I wanted to do this video is because I did officially pass the halfway point. I'm at 753.8 hours of active listening based on my spreadsheet. I always write down the minutes as I go. It's not too hard. It doesn't take very long. I just punch in the number every day. I have a pretty easy system. And again, I just kind of keep track as I go. And again, this 1,500 hours is purely anecdotal. I have heard, though, from different people that somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 hours is what it took for them to get to a very comfortable listening level. Again, I can't confirm that. I don't have any scientific evidence, and as far as I know, there are no at all any studies with regards to this. But yeah, I've heard it from different sources. Some people do report quicker results that seem like outliers, but if you look at the average of people's anecdotal experiences, it does seem pretty consistent. The 1,500 hours specifically comes from Dreaming in Spanish. He talks about 1,500 hours for him for Spanish. Well, for other languages, like for a typical, an English speaker learning a Romance language as their first, second language, 1,500 hours is his estimate. And I've always kind of just taken that as an act of faith because why not? And if it took less time, cool. And if it took more time, oh well. So in terms of what I've been listening to lately, or watching lately, this morning I watched Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the French dub, which was a lot of fun. I'll talk about how much I understood in a second, but I've also been watching a lot of She-Ra, the show on Netflix. It's better than you might think it is. There are some slow episodes. Season maybe 3 or 4. Maybe season 3 was like kind of but overall it's a really fun show. Really a lot of interesting characters. A lot of female characters, which is great, and a lot of diversity, which is really cool. And I like it a lot. I'm almost done it, but it's been a fun ride. And that show I definitely understood more than I would say Into the Spider-Verse. I would say my level of comprehension is significantly higher. And kind of a milestone was when I was watching, this show, The Hollow, which is basically I don't know, it's like an animated show, an adventure show. There's kind of a mystery about like who they are. I don't know, it's hard to describe. It's not the greatest show in the world, I don't think, but one thing that's interesting is that it's not that hard. And my subjective experience watching the second episode was that I understood almost everything 100%. Pretty close, like word for word, not really any ambiguity, not really any fuzziness. But again, that's my subjective experience, and it's very possible that there are things that I didn't even notice that I didn't notice. And that's the tricky thing sometimes about deciding what your level of comprehension is, because there's things that 100%, every time someone says, ça va, bonjour, every time you hear that, you're going to understand it, at least after a while, and there's no ambiguity of what that means. Qu'est-ce qui se passe? Qu'est-ce qu'il y a? Like, these things that if you've been listening and watching French for a while, there's no even thought process, it's instantaneous. That's pure acquisition, and then there's a level just above that where your brain has to sort of think about it for a second. Maybe there's a slight delay. Maybe sometimes you get it, sometimes you miss it, and but it's mostly there. There might be a slight fuzziness of nuance that you might be missing, and then there's the stuff that you sort of heard as a garble, and you're like, oh, I totally missed that. Nothing. I didn't get anything, but maybe next time I'll catch it. And then there's a level above that where you don't even notice that you're not hearing it or not noticing it because you're kind of focused on all the other stuff. And that's what's tricky sometimes. Again, like if you're trying to like say like percentage of understanding, I think it's almost impossible to do it accurately, especially unless you're at a very, very high level or very, very low level, because you don't know what you don't know and you don't know what you're missing really until you're very close where you almost understand absolutely everything. I've had the experience where I had the feeling of, yeah, I understand almost everything, but a few things, bits and pieces here I missed. And then I would come back to the show a year later and I realized, wow, there's so much I didn't hear the first, like before, but I still have the exact same subjective experience of, oh, I understood basically everything, but bits and pieces here and there. So understanding how much you're comprehending when you're listening, I think is a very difficult thing. And I think it's even to some extent true with reading because just because you can understand the story, and even if you understand every single word on a page, there's always going to be a level of nuance and of subtlety that you're probably missing or that's going over your head. That maybe you thought you understood almost everything, but there was actually quite a lot you were missing in terms of even the plot sometimes. So understanding your own level of comprehension is a very subjective thing, and it can be very difficult to communicate. Now, just to go at least a little bit more in depth, Matt versus Japan is releasing his website, refold.la, and he talks about these different levels of comprehension as a way to sort of quantify a little bit our understanding of what we're actually comprehending. And even then, again, it can be quite tricky to actually decide what level you are. But I guess I can kind of sort of describe maybe using a couple things, Shira, maybe Spider-Man to the Spider-Verse, and maybe I've been watching a show called, oh, what was it called? How about I could, the Le Bureau des Légendes I could use it as well. It's like a spy show. So those are all kind of different levels of comprehension. So now this is my understanding of it, and you might have Matt might have a slightly different interpretation of these descriptions, but this is my interpretation. So basically, the vast majority of my time doing listening practice has been in level 3, I would say, sometimes in level 2. And so actually, no, I would say quite a lot of time of my 750 hours has been in bits and pieces, where basically you're hearing lots of words, oh, I heard that word, and oh, once in a while I heard an entire sentence. That's amazing. But and you only have a vague sense of really what's going on. Like you can kind of piece together things with the pictures, but just from the dialogue alone, it's pretty like you're not really understanding the story, but you're getting the bits and pieces. Once in a while, you get a simple sentence or two, but it's rough. And I would say a huge chunk of my immersion so far, my listening immersion, has been in the bits and pieces phase. Again, depending on the media, especially with live action stuff. But also, a huge chunk of time has also been in the gist situation, the gist level, which is not as bad as you might think. It's not as low as you might think. So again, this is the idea that you're understanding a lot of words, and you are understanding many times, many sentences that you are understanding completely, and you're understanding the main ideas of what they're talking about for the most part. But you're missing a lot. You're missing a lot of the details, and there might be some parts of the story you're just a little confused about because you just don't quite follow the conversation. Like you are understanding lots of words. And again, I would say for most like live action, for a long time, I've been in the gist phase. Like I would say, listening to Le Bureau des Légendes, I would say most of the time I'm in the gist phase. It's a tough show. It's hard to say if it's the vocabulary or the accent, but I find it a difficult show to follow sometimes. It is a complicated, interconnected story, so that doesn't help. But even just like the simple dialogue, occasionally I find it tricky. In terms of level 4 is story. So this is the idea that you can follow the story and enjoy the plot, but you are basically missing details. And meaning that like you're hitting lots of sentences, you're understanding lots of full complete sentences word for word, but you're missing enough where like you can follow everything. You can follow like, oh, this conversation is about this person's angry about that. All right, now they have to go to this. So you're understanding the story and it's fun, but you are missing a lot, and you're missing a lot of words. Not even just like the subtle details, but like you're missing little phrases, or maybe you heard that whole sentence, but there's that one word you missed, so it's a little vague what that sentence meant. So then like you're kind of only hazy about what that few sentences were about, and but then there might be a stretch where you understand like 3 or 4 sentences in a row, and again, the story is not really a problem, but you are missing a lot, and I would say this is actually a pretty fun phase. This is kind of where I was at listening to Spider-Man to the Spider-Verse, where the most of the story was like fairly straight. Like I could understand the story, no problem. It was a lot of fun to watch, but I was missing a lot. Like there were little phrases I would miss, or like maybe he would say an expression I just didn't understand what it meant. Maybe it was a word I just didn't know. That was relatively rare, but like not hard to follow the story, but hard to understand. You're not getting every word. You're not listening to it word for word. So this is not word for word listening, but it's still fun. And I would say level 4 is where it starts to become fun, I would say, at least inherently. Like you're enjoying the media as media. Again, not quite the same as in English, because in English it's fairly effortless. But I think because you can enjoy the story, I think it makes the immersion so much more pleasurable. So kind of breaking through to the story level, I mean, it takes a long time, at least it did for me. I would say I would start getting to this point around 500 hours for me personally. Like, again, your mileage may vary, but when it's just pure listening, I would say roughly, yeah, around 500 hours maybe. The average show, live action, if you had to average out, animated live action stuff, just any random show, typically it'd be around there. Not every show, but that would be the idea. But yeah, it's definitely a lot of fun because you can follow the story, and you're also learning a lot all the time. You're constantly like noticing new words, new expressions, like, oh, I never noticed that. What could that mean? And then little by little, like, oh, that expression means that and stuff. So you're learning tons, and I would say you probably learn the most in this stage. And I think Matt is talking about that too. That you probably learn the most in the story phase. It's both fun and there's plenty of new things to learn, and that's great. Now, in terms of comfortable, I think sometimes people underestimate how much you should be comprehending for comfortable. Comfortable means you understand virtually everything word for word. Like literally every word, you could almost re-speak or say back almost every phrase that is said. You once in a while, every few minutes, you might miss a word, but the vast majority of the dialogue you are understanding and understanding all the messages and everything. It's just there's a certain fuzziness, I think, to the language that you're like, I'm not like I understand they said a phrase, I understand what it said word for word, but it's just like why did they say it precisely like that, or why would they use that phrase and not this phrase? It's like that was strange, or and that's my interpretation. So level 5 is very high. It's a very high level of comprehension, and it takes a long time. And I would say often Shira is that comfortable phase, meaning that I can understand virtually everything being said word for word. I might miss something once in a while, but not all the time. Sometimes Shira, for example, drops down to 4. I would say where I'm missing a few things every few seconds, but I'm still easily able to follow the story. But I would say the average is closer, I would say, to a 5. Maybe I'm like at 4.8 or something. I don't know how you can average it out. But like, because your comprehension goes up and down depending on how tired you are or your emotional state and just which part of the episode it is. And sometimes accent as well can play a role as well. But again, level 5 is very, very high. You're understanding virtually everything word for word, but there's a nuance to it that you're missing. And it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of mental energy. And the more tired you get, the harder it is to maintain that level of comfort, and you might even just drop down to 4. At least that's my experience. Like, I was watching the Spider-Verse, and a lot of it I was getting to level 5 for most of, the first third of the movie maybe, but as my brain got tired, it did feel sort of like it was dipping down to that. But again, that might be just a subjective thing. And the final thing is automatic. So this is where you're basically understanding everything perfectly, 100% word for word. There's no subtlety. There's virtually no details lost. There's no words you don't understand. There's no grammar that you're like, oh, I'm not sure what that really means. It's pretty much like perfect. But of course, no one's perfect because there are always words you might not know, even in your native language. But it's, as far as you can be concerned, virtually perfect, virtually effortless. I'm not really sure if there are anything in any media that I'm at automatic yet. Certainly nothing with listening, unless it's like even Peppa Pig. I would say I'm still at a strong, comfortable phase. Like I think I'd have to concentrate. Like I could understand everything word for word, virtually all the nuance and the subtlety. Not that there is a lot, but I still have to concentrate. It's not like I can just sit back and listen to it. Although it's been a while since I've listened to Peppa Pig. Not that because it's not very interesting. But again, like I would say, I wouldn't underestimate comfortable. At least this is my interpretation of this. Comfortable is very high, word for word, virtually everything, but there's subtlety and nuance and fuzziness still there. And I would say with a lot of books, for example, I don't think maybe there's some easy books that would be a level 6, but most books, at least that I find fun to read, a lot of books at least can be at level 5 comfortable, like novels. And it feels fun to learn, but in a way, sometimes comfortable is not as fun as 4, because 4 you're constantly learning new stuff all the time. It's quite a mental, fun activity. But with 5, it's like you understand virtually everything, the story and everything. There's very few words you don't know, but it still feels like it's just a little beyond your grasp of feeling like the automatic phase. Like it's effortless. You can just enjoy the story, kick back, read your book without looking much up at all. I don't think I'm really at that when it comes to novels. I've read about 40 books or so, and I think it takes a lot longer. And I think there's actually a gigantic gap between comfortable and automatic. I think there's a huge gap between all these, story and comfortable and automatic. But I think the difference between comfortable and automatic is pretty huge. Probably like it takes just as long to get to comfortable as it does to go from comfortable to automatic. That's my guess. So like if I'm, for example, mostly comfortable watching some dubbed anime as an example, I would say I flip between 4 and 5, but let's say often I can be at a level 5. It would probably take me another 750 hours for those simple shows to be an automatic, easy, effortless, that kind of thing. Something that might take me another year or so, which is fine. I mean, there's no rush, but for me at least, this listening comprehension thing is taking quite a while. And I've kind of talked about it before about how like the way people talk about their progress, I'm always surprised. Like they say, oh, I listened to 300 hours of TV and then I became fluent or whatever that means. And then I would do that. I'd be like, okay, I'll do it. I'll listen to 300 hours of TV. And then I'm like, I look around and think, wait a minute, I'm not nearly that good. I'm not nearly as what I thought I would be if I did the thing that that person said. And I definitely noticed that with books as well. Like there was this one guy who he posted on Reddit. I think he said, "Oh, I reached a pretty high level in French. I read," and he looked and he posted like the books that he read, and it was about 20 books. And like, so I was like, "Oh, fine, I'll read that much." And I read it, and I'm like, looked around, I'm like, "Wait a minute, I'm not that good yet. What's going on here?" And now it's possible that my progress is slower on average. Maybe I'm a little bit older than some learners, and that's fine. Maybe just naturally I improve slower than others. It's possible other people might be over exaggerating kind of their ability. It's very easy to exaggerate your ability, I think, with language learning and kind of present yourself as better than you are. But I think it's also important not to be false modest as well and try and be just as accurate as you can. And I think the levels of comprehension that were mentioned, that were put forward by Matt versus Japan and the new Refold website, I think is useful. But I think it's also important and useful to just be very clear about what the levels are. And level 4 takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time to get to it. And it's a lot of fun when you're there because you can enjoy the story. But to go from 4 to 5 takes a lot of work, a lot of listening, and go from 5 to 6, even way more work to be really comfortable. And again, these are just my opinion, of course. So, and everyone has different goals and stuff, but I would say, this 1,500 hours target that I had, several months ago or so, I think it's playing out pretty well. Like I'm again for like easier animated material, I'm inching from 4 to 5 pretty consistently. Sometimes like Into the Spider-Verse was a little bit harder. Closer to 4, I would say. But a lot of anime and She-Ra, for example, on average closer to a 5. And so I can feel my progress, and there's so much I can understand. But I'm also learning so much all the time. I think Matt versus Japan talked about this. That's like the funnest part, where you definitely you can enjoy the things and you can really experience the media. And it's not just a blur. It's not just kind of like trying to understand a story through a fog, but there is sort of inherent enjoyment in it, and it's exciting to discover new things. But there's still so much you can learn as well, and really probably yeah. And so that's where I'm at, I would say right now. And please don't say the fluent word because no one. What does that even mean anymore? Like I said, halfway to fluency is my estimation, I guess. Another 750 hours to have a solid level of fluency in terms of listening, at least, is the goal, and I think I'm on track for that. If you've been tracking your progress in French and you found that you've made faster progress, please tell me your secrets because I will listen to you. Because I am making steady progress. I do notice the progress over time, and I try not to take it for granted. But it's slow and steady, that's for sure. And it does feel subjectively like it's taking more time than the way people describe, say, the progress in Spanish or other similar languages, closer-ish languages that are closer to English. That the amount of immersion I've heard people do, and then what level of comprehension they describe it as, seems to be significantly less in Spanish. I've talked about before that French listening comprehension is fairly challenging and tricky. But again, this is all subjective, and it's possible that it's just difficult to describe listening comprehension in a way that's everyone can kind of agree and understand. So that's kind of those are my thoughts. It's kind of rambly, but again, this is kind of marking halfway point, halfway to a high level of French, at least in terms of listening comprehension. I'll talk about maybe reading another time when I hit my target of 50 books, which should be probably in the new year maybe. But yeah, that's it.